Now, I didn't plan it this way, but it just happened that this turned into the very classic 3-point sermon that I have for you today. The 3 points: see Jesus, recognize Jesus, heed Jesus. So today's post-resurrection story is another one that teaches us how to be church and how to expect Jesus' presence to us and how we're supposed to interact with that presence in that time post-resurrection. Guess what? That's what we're in. That's what we're always in. That's what we'll always be in. But there are particular clues in these resurrection stories that aren't necessarily so writ large in all the pre-resurrection stories. We are supposed to see Jesus, to recognize Jesus, and to heed Jesus. First, to see. The disciples are busy on the boat some way away from the shore. They're back now to their previous occupation of fishing. And there's always a lot to do when you're fishing. There's managing the boat and checking the bait and the nets, and sometimes some repair work that's necessary, sometimes even a little bailing. And even so, even with all that preoccupation, they see this person on the shore some distance away and notice that one. This is perhaps a message to the church. We should not be so caught up in what we are doing here inside the church that we fail to see those on the outside. We need to, of course, care for our common life. But when all we do is care for our common life and we fail to notice the neighbors around us, we are not in keeping with our Christian mission. We need to see our neighbors, the people who walk their dogs out there or launch a boat. We need to see the many tourists who come to town. We need to see those who perhaps are a little harder to see because they are hidden a bit, our hidden neighbors such as the elderly, immigrants, young people, those suffering from disease or mental illness, all those people who may be more inside their house. Nevertheless, we are called to see them. Second, we're supposed to recognize Jesus. Now, the disciples don't recognize him immediately. It's not an easy task to recognize Jesus. It takes some work. And many of our resurrection stories remind us that there's some effort involved in recognizing Christ. It helps us to hearken back to that scripture in which Jesus said, when you see one of your neighbors who's hungry or who's imprisoned, and you go and care for them, you are doing the same to me. That reminds us that our neighbors actually are the primary way in which we experience Jesus' presence. The neighbor actually is Jesus in a different guise. And so the job of recognizing Jesus in our neighbors is a huge bit of our Christian task. So we have to see our neighbors, We need to recognize that our neighbors are, in fact, Christ. And then finally, we are supposed to heed Jesus, to do what it is Jesus asks. And in our scripture lesson, it's simply fishing a different way than they thought. It's also being welcomed to a breakfast that Jesus makes, which we recapitulate around communion. Heeding Jesus' call to us also requires some effort. It requires that we regularly spend some time with Scripture. And whether that's some time that we spend individually with Scripture, or whether you avail yourself of some Bible study, or whether you pay close attention to the Scriptures that we center our worship around week after week, all of those help to tune our ears to Jesus' voice. Jesus' voice through Scripture is sometimes a little confusing, I'll grant you that, especially if you only focus on one and think you're done. But there is a larger picture that emerges when we spend a lot of time with Scripture, and we start hearing the themes that are Jesus's expressions over and over again about what he expects of those who would undertake the Christian way. What are we supposed to do as we heed Jesus' voice? We're called to love one another, to love God, to love our neighbor, and to love ourselves. We're called to respond to others with compassion and empathy. We're called to speak truth to power. However, we are called to pay attention to the ways in which we can empower each other in our daily lives. Remember, I have been talking to you about how Jesus does not call us to engage primarily in the work of politics. Jesus calls us rather to empower each other in our daily living, which may impact how we participate in politics, but it is the dailiness of our living in which we empower each other as Jesus calls us to do. And Jesus also calls us to have some humility, to stay quiet in our judgments of others, and to think of ourselves not more highly than we ought, which often is about putting ourselves as the last rather than the first. So Jesus' voice comes to us, calling us to love neighbor, respond to others with compassion, speak truth to power, empower daily lives and daily living, and to be humble. And heeding Jesus' voice is the third way in which we interact with Jesus in this time post-resurrection. Seeing, recognizing, heeding. And finally, this little reminder, all of this is done in community. We're not expected to do this alone. Rather, we do this with each other, and our story so delightfully highlights the way in which the community gathered to fish sees, recognizes, and heeds Jesus' voice. And then what happens? Jesus gives them breakfast. Soon we gather around the table. Let us rejoice, knowing Christ is with us. I would like to call Jeff Buck forward to give us a word about stewardship before we have our offering.